A beautiful Russian immigrant vanishes in California.
The fact that she would have just got up and left and abandoned her kids made no sense whatsoever.
Her ex-husband is a prime suspect.
Hans definitely thought he was smarter than everybody, especially the police.
But did he make her disappear, or did she run away?
I felt sick. I kept hoping that maybe she was pulling off some big scam.
It takes an epic courtroom battle to discover the truth. In 1997, a visionary 39-year-old computer scientist arrives in St. Petersburg, Russia. Hans Reiser is looking to outsource programming work for his booming Silicon Valley software company.
Hans was a brilliant person in some limited areas. I think that picking up normal social cues, normal sense of humor, he did not have. It was odd.
This awkward genius was also in Russia looking for love. One way he tries to find it is through an agency for so-called mail-order brides. It's how he first meets Nina Sharonova, a 24-year-old doctor, in April 1998.
Everybody who ever met her always said that she was just the kind of person that would walk into a room and would immediately command your attention.
She was a petite woman. She was very pretty. She had a quiet voice. She had a really great laugh. And I really liked her.
Within a year, Nina gets pregnant. The couple marry and move to Oakland, California.
They moved here to be together, and they looked like they were in love and looked like they were having fun.
By 2003, they have 2 children, 4-year-old Rory and 2-year-old Nayo. But despite outward appearances, their relationship is not a happy one.
Hans became jealous of Nina's ability to build friends and build a network outside of himself. Hans wanted Hans to be the only friend that Nina had.
Hans is still spending months at a time in Russia, and it finally takes a toll. During one trip, Nina begins an affair with his best friend. When Hans finds out, the marriage collapses.
Nina eventually filed for a divorce and moved out. They fought about everything. They fought over the money, they fought over the children, they fought over the education that the children should receive, medical treatment the children should receive, and there was almost nothing that they agreed on.
Even after they split, a bitter custody battle continues for almost 2 years.
The main thing that started up this craziness between them was that Hans was addicted to video games. He would play video games for hours on end. That was fine with Nina, but he wanted Rory to be doing that with him. He felt that a boy needs to become a warrior and a hero, and that American boys are cowardly.
As well as video games, Hans encourages his son to watch graphic war movies. Rory starts having nightmares and wetting his bed.
Nina believed a lot of the video games were too violent for the children, and Hans believed that the male child needed to play video games that were violent in order to develop his brain.
Bolstered by his belief that he is superior to everyone, Hans constantly belittles and undermines all those involved with the children's care. Their school, their doctors, even the judge hearing the custody case. As a result, Nina wins sole custody of both Rory and Nayo. Hans can't even see them without her approval. By the summer of 2006, Hans's company is struggling, and he has moved in with his mother. His life seems to be falling apart, while Nina, free of her antisocial ex-husband, appears to be thriving. She even has a new boyfriend.
She was happy with him. He and his children and Nina and her children got along very well. They went on camping trips and spent a lot of time together, and she was really excited about that.
In the last week of August 2006, Hans begs Nina to let their children stay with him over the upcoming Labor Day holiday. She reluctantly agrees, but only for part of the 3-day weekend. Sunday, September the 3rd. On her way to Hans's house, Nina stops to buy groceries at this supermarket in Berkeley, California. Security cameras capture her with the children at about 1:30 p.m. It will be the last time she is seen in public. Just half an hour later, she disappears.
At that point, the only information we had was that Nina went to the house where Hans lived, dropped the children off, and we knew the children were safe because they were with Hans, and Nina had completely vanished.
2 days later, Nina fails to collect the children after school as usual. A friend takes them home and calls the Oakland police. The case is assigned to the Missing Persons Bureau, who quickly make it a top priority.
People that go missing don't plan for the future. Going to the grocery store, dropping our children off, making plans to go eat with people. They just say goodbye to everybody and they go missing. In this case, Nina was planning for the future, so it was very suspicious.
It just didn't make sense that this woman would have just got up and vanished, leaving her kids behind, not knowing what was going to happen to them. Just sort of threw them up in the air and just let them go. It just didn't make any sense.
An extensive search for Nina is officially launched. The starting point is the last place she was seen alive, Hans Reiser's house.
Hans was contacted by an Oakland police officer. Hans's response was, "Contact my lawyer, I have nothing to say to you." Immediately in my mind, I thought to myself, this is really strange. I hope this isn't a murder case.
But despite his concerns, Gil continues to work on the basis that Nina is still alive and keeps trying to locate her.
I didn't know whether or not she had just had some kind of a little breakdown and thought, I can't deal with this anymore, and just needed to escape for a little while. But I mean, I knew that it wasn't the case, because she would never have left her kids, not for a minute.
A week after Nina disappears, police locate her minivan, parked on a street near Hans Reiser's house.
Inside Nina's van, we had some pretty important discoveries. She had bought some groceries, and those groceries were now rotting in the back of her van. Also inside the van was a cell phone. The battery was removed from Nina's phone, and the phone was flipped open. That's a tactic that people have learned from television will prevent law enforcement from doing GPS tracking.
The contents of the van suggest foul play, so detectives look again at who might want to hurt Nina. Top of the list is her ex-husband. By now the story has hit the local news, but Hans Reiser still isn't talking.
Hans, why aren't you talking to police?
Hans was acting like the epitome of a suspect. He didn't want to cooperate at all. Nobody wants to look like a homicide suspect when they are possibly a homicide suspect.
Increasingly concerned that Hans is involved in Nina's disappearance, Gil assigns a surveillance team to watch his every move. They report that, strangely, Hans is driving his mother's car. His own car, a Honda CRX, is missing. Hans also seems to know that he is being followed and employs amateur tactics to shake off the tail.
They were telling me that he was entering and exiting the freeway repeatedly, that he was driving into residential neighborhoods. At one point, he went to a local coffee shop and got some coffee and a newspaper and sat there and held the newspaper like he was reading it, but instead was looking up and down the street, kind of like on a detective's comedy.
Hans essentially changed his entire life after Nina went missing. And absolutely at no time, even though everybody else that knew Nina and loved Nina, and even those that didn't, people that were just concerned, were trying to find Nina, Hans never did anything, ever. Not even a phone call, not a search, nothing to help find the mother of his children.
After days of increasingly suspicious behavior, Hans leads the surveillance team straight to a crucial piece of evidence.
Ultimately, police officers followed him to his Honda CRX that he had hidden and that we had been looking for.
The right front passenger seat was completely missing. It was gone, with the bolts just laying there on the floor.
The carpeting was completely covered in water, like somebody had tried to hose out whatever was on that side of the car.
Despite Hans's apparent attempt to clean the car, he leaves behind a pile of possessions.
There was a sleeping bag stuff sack, and on the stuff sack there was a 1-inch by 3-inch square that had a blood stain on it.
Gil gets a warrant for Hans's DNA to see if it matches the bloodstain. And 5 weeks after Nina was last seen, the surveillance team arrests Hans Reiser.
The arrest was kind of a relief. I mean, it wasn't that I felt like, yay, but it was still, it felt like there was progress made.
The arrest includes a routine body search. Police are stunned by what they find.
He was wearing a fanny pack at that time. Inside the fanny pack was a passport, about $9,000 in cash. Most strikingly, I think, was his cell phone was also in his fanny pack, and his battery on his cell phone had also been disconnected and physically removed, just like Nina's had been.
At minimum, the evidence suggests Hans is about to flee the country, but it's hardly a smoking gun. With no solid proof of a crime, and with Hans as uncooperative as ever, Gil is forced to release him.
He continued to kind of carry himself as a more intelligent individual than all of us out there. All of our questions were answered with questions. He just seemed pretty indifferent to the entire thing.
Police regroup and consider the evidence in hand. Now they have 2 phones with the batteries removed and 2 abandoned vehicles recovered from Hans's neighborhood. They also have the blood-stained stuff sack. Hans's DNA test proves it is his blood, but further testing reveals Nina's blood is mixed with it. It's enough to get a search warrant for Hans's house. Gil calls in a team of forensic experts to go through it with a fine-toothed comb.
It took 2 days to do the search. They actually located a small spot of blood on a pillar right inside the entryway door of the house, and that was later determined to be Nina Reiser's blood.
But there is still one missing piece of the puzzle: Nina herself. Without a body to prove she is really dead, prosecutor Paul Horror must weigh the chances of getting a conviction for her murder.
I thought I was in big trouble, actually.
I literally brought over a moving box full of paperwork, and I put it on a man's desk and said, "Hey, this guy's a murder suspect. I need you to get him convicted." And the look that the district attorney and I exchanged was probably just priceless.
I initially thought he had done it, but that's different from being able to prove it. And it was probably about a month into the case, after I was working on it full-time, that I said to myself, we've got enough to prove it.
Although the case is entirely circumstantial, Hans Reiser is charged with murder, and Horror prepares for trial.
There are 3 questions you have to answer in order to decide whether or not this crime was committed and the defendant's guilty. Number 1, is Nina dead or alive? Number 2, if she's dead, did Hans kill her? And then number 3, was it murder or was it manslaughter?
Horror decides his opening witness must be one of the last people to see Nina alive, the couple's son, Rory. Unfortunately, Nina's mother has taken him beyond the reach of US law.
Nina's mother had come over to the United States, had been given permission to take the kids back to Russia for Christmas vacation, and she never brought them back. I begged Nina's mother for months to make sure that Rory came to the United States and testified as a witness. I thought that was imperative to prove this case, that the jurors see and hear Rory.
November the 7th, 2007, the murder trial of Hans Reiser begins. Detective Gil knows it will be a monumental task to prove he is a killer.
I knew that Hans had murdered Nina. I was absolutely convinced. But there's always that, what if the jury doesn't understand the the dynamics of the case or how convoluted the case is, or what if there's just so much evidence that the jury's not able to put the pieces together?
The judge bans cameras from the courtroom, but allows a sketch artist to document the entire trial. After Hora presents his theory that Nina is dead, Hans Reiser's attorney, William Dubois, offers the jury an alternative vision, that Nina is still alive.
The defense tactic was to take advantage of the fact that there was no body and assume that they could successfully, or that I would fail at proving that Nina was, beyond a reasonable doubt, dead. And that if that was the case, of course, I couldn't prove that there was a homicide.
Dubois tries to paint a picture of Nina as a deceitful adulteress who only married Hans to gain US citizenship. In all likelihood, she is in Russia now, with her mother and her children.
There was always this possibility I had to eliminate, that she didn't just take off, get fed up, and run away. So it was one of those things that scared me as a prosecutor. Hey, I better be able to prove Nina's not in Russia.
I was hoping that she wasn't dead. But that would have been such an elaborate con that she was playing on him, and there would be no reason for that. It just didn't, it made no sense.
Just after opening statements, the prosecution unveils its star witness, Hans and Nina's son, Rory, now 8 years old. Heeding Paul Hora's pleas, his grandmother brought him back to the United States. He is the first person to take the stand.
His testimony was phenomenal. In fact, when he showed up to meet me the day before his testimony, he had drawn a picture. And it was a picture that he said to me was a picture of Hans carrying a bag down the stairs in the middle of the night. And he thought that Nina was maybe inside the bag. It sounded sort of far-fetched to me at first, but when he testified, he actually got off the witness stand and crouched down on his hands and knees and balled up like a little cannonball in front of the jury and to describe how he thought he had seen his mother inside this bag. I had asked him at one point, "What do you miss about your mother, Rory?" And he said, "Everything. I haven't seen my mom for, a year and a half, and I don't know where she is, and she doesn't call me on my birthdays, and she's gone." I mean, it was just really powerful testimony.
For 3 months, District Attorney Hora lays out his case in meticulous detail. He presents a mountain of evidence to suggest that Nina is dead. The minivan and the rotting groceries, the bloodstains in Hans's house and car, and the simple fact that no one has seen her in more than a year. He also tells the jury that Hans had strong motive, how his infatuation with Nina turned to hatred, and his outrage over losing control of the children. Hora calls Nina's divorce lawyer, Shelley Gordon, to the stand.
I testified over, I think it was 2.5 days. I was CC'd on a lot of emails that Nina had sent to me after Hans had sent them to her that showed Hans's real anger and venom toward Nina.
In one of Hans's ranting emails, he appears to threaten Nina directly.
The problem here is that you think you can smile at me and I will forget. Those who anger slowly, cool slowly, Nina.
Nina had sole legal custody, and Hans had no legal custody, which means he was cut out of the loop of making decisions about the health, education, and welfare for his kids. That drove him nuts. I think that's why he killed Nina, because he thought she was going to ruin Rory.
But the heart of the prosecution case is Hans's own extremely suspicious conduct. In the aftermath of Nina's disappearance, he behaved like the very model of a murder suspect. The epic trial drags on into 2008 as the defense presents its own stack of evidence. They claim Nina embezzled from Hans's software company, where she worked as a part-time bookkeeper. They call witnesses who suggest Nina was poisoning the kids against their father. Above all, they try to show that Hans is no criminal, just a socially inept geek. Almost everybody who knows him testifies that his weird behavior is simply the result of an unorthodox mind and a massive superiority complex. As if to prove that point, Hans ignores the advice of his own lawyers and takes the stand himself.
As a prosecutor, you always hope that the defendant takes the witness stand, and you do hope that because you figure you've got the evidence to prove the guy's guilty, and that if he gets up there, he's going to have to lie, and if he lies, everyone's going to know it. And if you lie, then you're probably guilty. Otherwise, why are you lying?
Convinced he can outsmart the court, Hans has an explanation for everything. He removed the passenger seat from his car, for example, because he thought it would be more comfortable for sleeping. He was trying to avoid the police surveillance team because he assumed they were corrupt and trying to frame him. As for his passport and the $9,000 found in his fanny pack, he dismisses it as random debris.
He was on the stand for 11 days, just digging his own grave, I think.
Hans gives a seemingly endless stream of rambling, argumentative answers. He contradicts himself over and over, even apologizing for suggesting the police were corrupt.
He was a miserable witness. When Hans was finished with direct examination, in other words, when his lawyer was finished questioning him, I knew he was toast. I mean, I knew he had done himself in without me even asking a single question. He was that bad.
After nearly 6 months of trial, the case goes to the jury.
I think I was pretty stressed out when it went to the jury's hands. I didn't want that guy getting out of jail. I wanted Hans to be locked away forever.
On April the 28th, 2008, after 3 days of jury deliberation, the judge allows cameras into court to hear the verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Hans Reiser, guilty of a murder. We, the jury, fix the degree of the above offense as murder of the first degree.
I was very satisfied that he was found guilty, and I was a little surprised he was found guilty of first-degree murder. I thought it would be second-degree murder, but the jury felt like it was premeditated.
I had all sorts of emotions when he was found guilty. I was excited because at that point I had realized that we had done the job that we were supposed to do. But at the same time, I was still disappointed because Nina was still gone.
Nina's killer has been convicted, but for Nina's family, there's no closure until her body is found and they can lay her to rest.
Right before Hans was going to be sentenced to the first-degree murder verdict, I met with him on the 4th of July in jail with Hans and his lawyer, and we reached an agreement that if you show me where Nina's body is and you waive all your appeal rights, I will agree, with the court's permission, to reduce the murder verdict from a first-degree murder to a second-degree murder. And he agreed.
As part of his plea bargain, Hans must also provide a full confession.
Hans said that after Nina came over and dropped the kids off, they got into a verbal dispute. And he said Nina looked at me in a way with a smile that I thought was sort of a smirk. And I struck her. Don't you walk away from me. And then he choked her to death with his bare hands.
I'm just sickened to think about how scared she must have been then. And the kids were in the house, which is just horrible.
On July the 7th, 2008, Hans Reiser finally leads Paul Horer and the police to Nina's body. Handcuffed to his lawyer, he takes the search team into dense woodland, less than a mile from his house in the Oakland Hills.
Where she was located, we would have never found her.
Hans led us through the trails and finally to a location where Nina was. And he said, she's right there. And we started digging, and lo and behold, once we got, about 3 feet deep, inside the hole was Nina, but Nina was in a bag. And that bag was just as Rory had described to me in that picture that he had given me when he came to the United States to testify. I mean, it was very chilling for me to see that.
To see her at the bottom of a pit was just disgusting and surreal. I couldn't believe it.
The Hans Reiser case was Detective Ryan Gill's first murder investigation, and it proved to be too much. Not long afterwards, he decided to leave the Oakland Police Department to work in a smaller, safer community.
One of the reasons I left missing persons was that this case just takes a lot out of you. And you start looking at every single missing person like it's the Reiser case. And I think it just stresses you out every time your phone rings.
Hans Reiser was sentenced to life in prison for second-degree murder. He will be eligible for parole in the year 2023.
He screwed everything up. He could have been doing very well, making money, getting fame and fortune, and he totally screwed up and ruined a lot of lives.
In late August 1990, a peaceful university campus is rocked by a serial killer. The Gainesville Ripper's final body count is 5 students.
He loved to kill. He absolutely relished in it. It was the high point of his life.
4 years later, the victims' families finally confront Danny Rolling, their children's alleged killer.
I felt the evil that was in this person.
But is Danny Rolling himself a victim?
He has a very serious illness.
In 1990, Gainesville, Florida is ranked as one of the most desirable places to live in America. And it's home to the 6th largest university campus in the United States. In August, the fall semester is about to begin, and the town is bustling with students. One of them is 18-year-old Sonia Larson.
I mean, this was like her first home away from home and college. And so, yeah, it was an exciting time for her. It's going to be an exciting time for any freshman coming into Gainesville and starting your life.
Nothing could prepare Sonia's family for what happens next. On Sunday, August 26th, Sonia and her roommate, 17-year-old Christina Powell, are found murdered. Both girls have been stabbed repeatedly with a combat knife.
So when the phone call came later about the tragedy, I just screamed. I just screamed and screamed and screamed.
Gainesville is stunned when 9 hours later, a third victim is discovered. 18-year-old sophomore Krista Hoyt. She had also been viciously stabbed with the same kind of weapon.
Krista was a person that loved life. She was the type of person that was very caring.
Krista worked part-time as a records clerk at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. So for the first police officers to arrive, this crime scene is particularly traumatic.
These police officers had worked with Krista. They knew her personally and had gone into that crime scene and had spent the night there. And then now they had to come and tell us what had happened.
Krista's family are still struggling to come to terms with her death when they're hit with another shock. The local press reveals the gruesome details of their daughter's murder.
We only knew that she had been stabbed. We did not know that she had her breasts cut off or that she had been gutted or that she had been beheaded and that their head had been moved to a different section in the apartment. We didn't know any of that, so this is total shock to us.
All 3 of the victims were sexually assaulted and grotesquely mutilated. But the body count continues to rise. 2 days later, Manuel Taboada and his roommate Tracy Paules, both 23, are found butchered in their apartment. A media frenzy descends on the town, which is now dubbed Grisly Gainesville. The once peaceful community is gripped by terror. With no one knowing when or where the killer will strike next, students leave the town in droves.
I'm scared to death. I called my mom and she was crying. She said, just come home. I'm just really scared. This whole thing is just hitting so close to home.
It was amazing that for several weeks it was unlike any panic you would see in a small town.
Within days of the murders, Florida launches one of the most expensive manhunts in its history to track down the Gainesville Ripper. The police assemble a task force of over 150 agents who pursue thousands of leads. Meanwhile, the victims' families wait in agony.
We don't know what's going on. We can't really get any answers. So I became more and more frustrated that I didn't know exactly what had happened to Krista.
But what investigators don't realize is how close they have already come to catching the killer. The same day the bodies of Manuel Taboada and Tracy Paules were discovered, Gainesville police officers had pursued a man they suspected of bank robbery. Although he managed to evade capture, the police stumbled across his campsite. It's close to where Krista Hoyt had been murdered. In his tent, they had found stolen cash from a local bank. With the robber still at large, they seized his belongings and stored them as evidence. Then, on the 7th of September, just over a week after the Gainesville murders, police in nearby Osala County, Florida, arrest 36-year-old drifter Danny Harold Rolling. He is charged with the attempted armed robbery of a local supermarket. 4 days later, a judge finds Danny Rolling guilty and sentences him to jail. Meanwhile, in Gainesville, the killing spree ends as abruptly as it started.
And people kept wondering, why did it stop? We now know that's because of the bank robberies, but we didn't know that at the time, and so people lived in just tremendous fear.
Finally, in January 1991, 5 months after the murders, the task force gets a break. A tip-off from police in Shreveport, Louisiana, Danny Rolling's hometown.
We were let in on all the investigation, where it stood and who they were looking at. And we had heard that the people from Shreveport had called them and said, you know, this might be a person to look at.
They revealed that Danny Rolling is their chief suspect in a 1989 triple homicide.
Our ID people, they went in and saw the same thing we did, and as bad as it was a thing for us to witness, I could only imagine how bad it was for the 3 victims that actually experienced Mr. Rolling's presence.
The crime bears striking similarities to those in Gainesville. The victims had been stabbed to death, and their bodies posed grotesquely.
A similar type murder had taken place where he had staged the victims. And they had him as a suspect.
The Gainesville police now revisit all the crimes committed in the town at the time of the murders. They examine the items found in the bank robber's campsite in the woods. The evidence includes a screwdriver, a ski mask, and a cassette tape deck. Only now do they play a cassette found in the player, apparently recorded on the night of the first murder. It begins.
Danny Harold Rolling.
That puts Danny Rolling in Gainesville when the murders took place. On the tape, he describes how to butcher a deer.
Aim for the lungs.
straight through the rib cage. Either there or the heart, but he'll stay right there until he bleeds to death.
And that's exactly the method he used on some victims.
The tape ends with an ominous suggestion.
Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit. That's something I got to do.
The task force are overjoyed when DNA tests come back, linking 3 of the murders to Rolling's campsite. They are confident that they have their man. Still, it takes over 9 months until Rolling is formally indicted for the murders.
It is an 11-count indictment. Count 1, first-degree murder for Christina Powell.
Rolling claims he is innocent. So over the next 3 years, the task force gathers a wealth of evidence against him. Finally, on February the 15th, 1994, 4 years after the Gainesville murders, Danny Rolling enters Alachua County Courthouse. It's the first time the victims' families come face to face with their loved one's alleged killer.
I guess the one thing that kind of bothered me was, he was in a suit and he looked like one of the lawyers sitting there. You couldn't really tell who was who,
I felt the evil that was in this person that had committed these crimes. I could just think that this was the last person that had looked in Krista's eyes.
The victims' families are determined that Rolling should receive the death penalty for his crimes.
He did horrendous things. He delighted in it. I just really, really wanted the death penalty for this.
Chief Prosecutor Rod Smith, a native of Gainesville, has spent months preparing his case.
Rolling was so much pressure, and I felt like if I did something wrong, I will have let down people who've known me since before I was a lawyer.
But as the court moves to select the jury, Rolling makes a shocking announcement.
There are some things that you just can't run from, and this being one of those.
Rolling changes his plea to guilty to all 5 counts of murder.
He was trying to manipulate his sentence. He did not want to get the death penalty.
But I really didn't feel like he had any remorse. I really felt more like that he was proud of what he had done.
The prosecution is convinced that by pleading guilty, Rolling believes the gruesome details of his crimes will not be revealed to the jury.
Danny Rolling entered the plea only after we had gone through a series of weeks of hearings, and it became clear to him that all of the evidence was going to get in. And Rolling never wanted himself to look bad. He had this heroic view of himself, and this was anything but heroic actions.
Rod Smith has no intention of allowing this vicious killer to manipulate his sentence.
What I wanted to make sure is I wasn't going to allow that plea to be the method by which suddenly the jury didn't get to really find out how bad he was.
He is determined to get the death penalty. But first, he must convince the jury.
I was worried because Gainesville is a community that had not given the death penalty in many cases.
Smith sets out to prove that Rolling committed premeditated, cold-blooded murder 5 times.
We really had to go back and paint Danny for what he was, which was a sexual aberrant, a mean and vicious person.
He describes how Rolling had assembled a murder kit, which included a screwdriver, duct tape, balaclava, and a combat knife.
The detail by which we were able to go back and find how he had bought the knife. He made a purchase. He paid about $34 plus tax. He bought an item in the Army-Navy store through the use of the barcode. The item he purchased was a Marine Corps K-bar knife. The depth of his planning for this event gave the juror the idea that this was something he came here to do, nothing but to do this. He was going to visit this misery on a college town.
Next, Smith produces one of his key exhibits, the photographs of the crime scenes.
They certainly were something that they got your attention unlike anything you would imagine.
The images show how Rolling mutilated and posed his victims' body parts to provoke and shock those who found them.
Jurors were so taken aback that some asked not to proceed that day.
Smith notices that the crime scene photographs even seem to affect the normally impassive Rolling.
Every time a photograph of what he had done was there, Rolling would almost avert his eyes and even physically act like he was getting ill. Well, of course, I continued to make sure every time I got a chance at that point in time, I'd put it in front of him.
Finally, Smith produces his most damning piece of evidence, Rolling himself.
Probably the breakthrough in the case, which we then kind of recreated for the jury, to me, was how we came to finally get Danny to talk.
While in prison awaiting trial, Rolling told investigators he wanted to confess his crimes through fellow inmate Bobby Lewis. During a 3-hour confession, Rolling admitted to all 5 murders.
I'm now willing to make a statement and answer any questions concerning Gainesville's murder case and or any other crime which I have participated in.
Smith also reveals that Rolling boasted to his fellow inmates about the chilling details of his victims' last hours.
3 of the victims he literally tortured for sexually and otherwise for hours. He talked to them, he told them what he was going to do to them, and he told them how it was going to be. It's unimaginable, the horror.
When you start hearing the horrors that happened, it's too much. Even in a horror movie, I wouldn't want to see this.
When they came upon Krista's crime scene and started talking about Rolling entering, waiting for her, what all he had done to her, what he had said to her, how long she was alive, how I knew in my heart that Krista was so terrified and she was alone.
I remember a gasp, I mean audible gasping from jurors.
But perhaps the prosecution's most important testimony is that which reveals the killer's real motive for the murders. Their witness is hardened criminal and Rolling's confessor, Bobby Lewis.
He was trying to terrorize the city of Gainesville. He was trying to make himself infamous or famous. He wanted to be a superstar amongst criminals.
Now it's Rolling's defense team's turn to try and convince the jury that their client is not accountable for his crimes. If they succeed, they could save Rolling from the death penalty. Their evidence excusing Rolling for his actions comes from the same police interview in which he confessed to his crimes. In it, he identified an alter ego he called Gemini.
The person that I really had struggled against to prevent becoming, to prevent ruling my thoughts and stuff is a person called Gemini, who is evil. Period.
Danny Harold Rolling is, and has been since before these crimes, mentally ill. This evidence will be helpful in understanding how the same person can rape and murder, then later regret these acts and feel compassion for the living loved ones surviving his violence.
The defense presents several witnesses to back up the claim of mental illness. From expert psychiatrists.
He has a very serious illness.
To Rolling's own family.
Danny would talk about visions of demons, people in his dreams beating him, torturing him.
But in cross-examination, the prosecution dismisses Rolling's Gemini explanation as a deliberate ploy to bolster his insanity claim.
He had watched this movie, The Exorcist Part 3 or Part 4. He told these scenes that were right out of a movie that he had just watched over at the theater in Gainesville. I think jurors then found all of that to be laughable.
The greatest threat to the prosecution lies in the defense's evidence of Rolling's violent upbringing.
They were going to try to show that Danny had had this abused childhood and that he was really just the victim of a set of circumstances in his life and that they ought to spare his life.
The defense claims that from an early age, Rolling was repeatedly bullied, beaten, and humiliated by his father. A key witness for the defense is Rolling's terminally ill mother, Claudia, who testifies by video link.
Did there come a time when you thought that the way your husband was treating Danny was inappropriate?
I always felt it was.
She describes in detail the violent relationship between Rolling and his father.
He had a way of, he'd make a fist, and in the top of their head, he'd do this real hard.
Still, the victims' families feel no sympathy.
I believe that there are many people that grow up in adverse conditions. But children don't always grow up to be serial killers.
But Rod Smith is aware that the defense's evidence about Rolling's past could undermine his case.
There were influences there that I was worried that they might try to make more of.
On March the 22nd, 1994, Rod Smith makes his closing argument. Despite Rolling's confession and a wealth of damning evidence, Smith's hopes for the death sentence hang in the balance.
People plead guilty all of the time and confess all the time. That doesn't really mean the jurors are going to give the death penalty. It doesn't happen that way.
He concludes by urging the jury to make the right decision.
I wanted to go back and really say, you have to do your duty. That's what this is. If you fail to do your duty now, the rest of your life you will live with that.
The jury must now decide the fate of Danny Rolling. It takes 2 days of deliberation for them to reach their decision.
But it was a nail-biter because you just didn't know what was going to come out.
I was not at all calm and collected. I was a nervous wreck.
When the jury went out at the end of the trial, I felt like they should come back right away with a verdict and that it would be the death penalty. But they didn't come back right away. And we had to wait overnight. I just prayed constantly.
Finally, on the 24th of March, 1994, the jury returned to the courtroom.
So, Mr. Clerk, if you would publish the verdict of the jury, please.
The first-degree murder of...
One by one, they announced their unanimous decision. Danny Rolling is guilty of first-degree murder on all 5 counts.
That it imposed the death penalty upon Danny Harold.
Judge Stanley Morris then delivers his judgment.
It is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Danny Harold Rolling, is hereby sentenced to death for the victim.
For the families, it's the culmination of 4 years of unbelievable grief.
Those families had spent every single day from the day they received the first phone call living over this.
When I got through with that trial, I was in shock. I was in total shock from all the anxiety and sadness that I had in me.
It's like going to watch the 4th of July and there was only one, and it wasn't even that good.
Even with Rolling's conviction and sentence, it will never replace the lives he destroyed.
It will never be over for us. Mom said that until she's 6 feet under, that's when it'll be over for her.
And the families know that justice could still be a long time coming.
But I also knew that here in the state of Florida, things can go on for 10, 15, 20 years before that happens.
Not until 16 years later, on October the 25th, 2006, does Rolling's execution finally take place. The victims' families come together once more to witness the final moments of their loved one's murderer. Rolling is administered a lethal injection and draws his last breath at approximately 6:13 p.m.
He died such an easy death. I mean, it's no pain at all. They give him a painkiller and then they kill him.
Danny Rolling may be gone, but the community he terrorized will never fully recover from his horrific crimes.
Rawlings didn't just kill 5 students. He had his toll on everybody from the horrendous acts he did.
Today on the University of Florida's Gainesville campus, a grove of trees stands as a permanent memorial to ensure that his 5 victims will never be forgotten.
I'll always think of these kids, and I'll always think of those families. Never fails, probably won't till the day I die.